So our speaker today is Bill Sutherland, and he's the Director of Research at the University of Cambridge Department of Zoology and was previously the Miriam Rothschild Professor of Conservation Biology. He's been the President of the British Ecological Society, and he's been a Fellow of St Catherine's College, Cambridge since 2008. In the early 80s, he was awarded the a NERC postdoctoral fellowship to Wolfson College at Oxford. And after completing his postdoctoral research, he joined the School of Environmental Sciences at the University of East Anglia and went on to hold a professorship in biology at the School of Biological Sciences. His research interests largely involve predicting the consequence of environmental change. And he's probably one of the most cited conservation biologists around today. His research interest involves predicting the consequences. His two main key contributions have been horizon scanning exercises to identify future priority issues and the 100 important questions in various disciplines. Bill has won countless awards, and which I won't list, and is extremely highly cited with over 70,000 citations on Google Scholar. So thank you very much, Bill, for joining us today. And we look forward to listening to your talk.
So thanks very much for that very kind discussion. And I'm delighted to be, well, I'd love to be with you there now, but I'm delighted to be talking to the group. Obviously a well-known group, lots of exciting research being done there, well-respected globally group. What I'd like to do is to talk about how we can make conservation more effective, and I think it's largely a cultural change that we need. So I'm going to start by talking about this thing, the Flying Fortress. The Flying Fortress B-17 was the world's largest aeroplane. Boeing put a lot of effort into it, and then on its test flight, it flew and tragically it crashed and the test pilot died. And they ended up by concluding that it was too complicated to fly. And Boeing almost went bankrupt as a result because they had this disastrous plane on them. And then a group of test pilots got together and said, yes, this is a really complicated plane, but what we need is a set of a checklist of activities. And if we have that checklist, then we can just follow those through and then it'd be flyable. And they did that and it became a massive commercial success. The second thing that happened once it became a routine plane is used to come in with everything working, with the pilot being fine, arrive just above the airstrip, and then crash, as you can see here, which the airplane companies found rather irritating. And so they brought in a psychologist, Alfonso Chapanis, to say, what's the problem here? And what he discovered was that there are two knobs on the plane, one for the flaps and one for the wheels. And they'd come in after a very long flight, sometimes late at night, just about to land. And instead of pulling the wheels knob, they'd pull the flap knob and then crash. I'm not actually sure why you need a psychologist to do this, but then this became routine. And in the States, by law, these have to have different symbols. But what that showed is these two activities of using checklists and continually learning from experience have massively improved safety. So just if you looked at the Miracle on the Hudson videos and listened to the astonishing tape, the co-pilot is spending all this time just going through the checklists and working out what to do. Before they set off, they looked at the checklist. It's routine practice. And this is an example of a checklist that's been used in medicine. And there are things like and they've done experiments being medics showing that if you use this checklists, then the risk of serious problems goes down by 17%. And there are things like, have you got the right patient? Do you know where the problem is, which side it is? Have you got sufficient blood in case of an emergency? Have you labeled all the specimens? They're kind of obvious stuff, but that makes a real difference. So it shows that it's the practice often that makes a difference. But as a result, largely of these two activities, the safety of planes has gone up enormously. The number of accidents and the number of fatalities has dropped. The number of journeys has increased enormously. So the accidents per journey has plummeted. My second example is the construction industry. This is just a tedious example of a building plan, and it's full of lots of detail. And it's full of detail because there are planning regulations. And if you're to build a tower or a window or an arch or a bridge, there's a whole set of building regulations. And these building regulations are constructed because you have groups of experts that bring together the evidence and then assess that and then work out what should be done. And so you as an architect are using evidence-based practice without being remotely aware of that. And if you look at things like the number of fires that have taken place in buildings, deaths from fires, they've plummeted enormously. We've worked out what to do and implemented it. A third example is comes from medicine. This is James Lind, and scurvy used to be a huge problem on ships, and so James Lind decided to do the world's first randomized control trial. And here's a painting of him doing the first randomized control trial. He picked pairs of people who had scurvy, and he tried to pick them so that they were as similar as possible in the state of their scurvy. And then he gave them one of 6 treatments. He gave them a quarter of cider or vinegar 3 times daily in gruel. So some of these were better than others. And elixir of vitriol, which is basically sulfuric acid, or half pint of seawater, or oranges and lemons, or this horrible sounding mixture, and then sought to see how they did. And they all got worse, except for those that were given oranges and lemons, who got so much better, they could then treat the other patients and help with the experiment and give the other patients their sulfuric acid. So having invented the randomized controlled trial, Lin then went on to invent the systematic review, which is what you have here, in which he said, I'm not interested in what people think. I'm interested in what people have observed. And he pulled together all of these observations and then came out with some sensible recommendations as to what we needed to do to stop scurvy. So here's a summary of dates. The first thinking of using oranges and lemons was in 1593. James Lancaster, I've described it, he did a little pseudo-replicated but neat experiment where he had 4 boats, one without, one in which they were given citrus and no one got scurvy. Then James Lind did his randomized controlled trial, and then he published the treaty on scurvy, pulling together that evidence. So it became pretty clear then what to do. So the Royal Navy leapt into action, and 40 years later started taking citric fruits, which is why they were called limeys. And then, impressed by this, a mere 70 years later, the Merchant Navy did this. And the thinking is that over that time, about 1 million lives were lost in the British Navy. The British Navy was immense due to scurvy. So the 2 big lessons from this are that the 3 lessons: experiments give you the answer. There's lots of suggestions for all sorts of things, but if you do experiments, you find out what the problem is. That if you pull the literature together, you can understand what's going on. And there's often a remarkable delay between working out what needs to be done and finding and it actually being implemented. And there are 3 major lessons, I think. And you can see this now in medicine. So, so in aircraft safety, it's about checklists and it's about continually improving practice and design. In engineering, it's about having building standards. And in medicine, it is about doing systematic reviews and giving medics the training so that they can understand systematic reviews and randomized controlled trials, and particularly by providing guidance, such as this guidance on COVID, which they take the literature together and say this is what can be done. So what I'm saying is that in these three fields, there have been enormous improvements of practice by embedding evidence into decisions by different routes. But if you look at almost any other area outside those three, it's much more amateur, and there's far less of the embedding science into practice. And you can see this just as, to pull out a couple of examples, mangrove restorations. I'm sure you have many in Australia, that mangrove restorations can work, but there's a long tradition of mangrove restorations working really badly. Or I pulled together in this book, Transforming Conservation book, some of the examples showing that when they tested evidence-based medicine compared to standardized good practice, the sort of thing us as conservationists do, there was a 19% reduction in deaths, a 29% reduction in hospital stays. But then if you look at a range of studies, it shows that either there's a big mix in practice or that it's clear we're not carrying out the most effective actions. There's big variation, and it's quite clear that we could improve our practice. And the reasons for thinking we could quite possibly double our effectiveness if we were to embed evidence into practice. Although it's actually less good than that, there are a number of problems we've discovered that, in fact, this is Jessica Walsh, who's now in Australia, showing that when practitioners start off, they don't look at the full range of possible options. So she studied practitioners studying ways of stopping predators from eating your birds that you're trying to conserve. And on average, they'd heard of about 60% of the options. They hadn't heard of 40% of the options. It's a bit like wearing blinkers so that you only think of a subset. The ways in which judgments are made aren't made in the ways that are shown to be most effective. And again, the Australian Mark Bergman been heavily involved in showing how we make decisions. There's good ways and bad ways, and we tend to do the bad ways. Decision making, there's a whole set of processes, some of which I'll talk about, which we tend not to do. We tend to just discuss a problem and then make a decision, not have a structured process. We don't use costs much, and when we do present costs, we don't present them in a way that makes sense. There's all sorts of other sources of information, indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, experience of people. That's not used and brought together in a sensible, logical manner. There's little learning from failures, and there's rarely very effective learning from conservation practice that goes back into learning about what we should do in the future. So there are serious problems, I think. And just one example. So we became interested in guidance. So in medicine, guidance is very important. It's one of the main ways in which evidence is converted into practice. And we did a review of the guidance that people have used in the UK, and we looked at 200 bits of guidance with Harriet Downey leading this. And we showed that almost never did they, only a small proportion of studies quoted references, but almost never did they say, do this action because of this bit of research. It didn't link the recommendations to the evidence. And very often there's just a list of actions, and you didn't know whether or not they're based on a single study, a set of studies, someone's experience, or just someone thinks it's a good idea, all of which are right, but you really need to know where you stand. So this is the guidance on growing mistletoe, grown by our major horticultural society in Britain. And the intriguing thing is that if you look at each of these bits, each of these recommendations, all of them are contradicted by the science. So there's no evidence that trees, you've got to pick the right, that they're host specific. There's no evidence that those at Christmas are so bad that they're worth abandoning. Some of them may well be sufficient to grow. It seems that you need small branches, young branches rather than old branches, that they're very light sensitive. So if you put them, make a cut and put the seeds in a cut and cover it in a flap of hessian, it's dark and it won't grow. So look at this guidance and do the opposite of everything it says there. So we then said, how can we then make the evidence available? And we've done a couple of things. We've got this website, Conservation Evidence, where we looked at 1.6 million papers and summarized the evidence into 3,600 different actions. And you can click on, say, bat conservation, and it gives you the different actions, and it tells you what the evidence then is for each of those. So, for example, if you're interested in some marine actions, this will tell you the different actions that could be carried out for the different groups and whether that's likely to be beneficial or trade-off and so on. And then the other thing we've done is called metadata set, where we just have a data set of 17,000 effect sizes with a set of tools, so you can then do your own analysis. So we've done this for Spartina, which is an invasive plant that you have in Australia. And you can say, I'm interested in seeing what the effectiveness of herbicides are against cutting, or this herbicide against that herbicide, or I want to look at the effect on the Spartina or the soil animals or whatever, and I want to just look at studies from Australia and East Asia, or I just want to look at studies from the Americas. You can do your own analysis in whatever way you want. And that to us seems a very powerful way forward. So that's how we presented the evidence. And then we've been interested in how to look at the guidance. And the way we've done this is we've started from the evidence. We've said, here's a set of issues in relation to restoration, creation, management of salt marshes and tidal flats. Here's a set of issues. What is the evidence? And let's summarize that evidence and then go to practitioners and say, what's your experience of carrying out these actions? Have you got case studies that illustrate this? So it's very much evidence-based guidance. And that to us is what we really need at scale. So different approaches for restoration. We've got guidance on reprofiling salt marshes or restoring, recreating salt marshes, managing the vegetation, chemical control of Spartina, physical control, integrated control. So this is the sorts of actions, broad actions we've been carrying out. And then there's a bit of guidance on each that says, here is all the information on chemical control of Spartina and what the effectiveness is of different herbicides, etc. And similarly on tidal flats. So there's been a lot of interest now in just improving the rigor in saying what evidence really matters, rather than saying all evidence is equal, saying that some evidence is better than others, and we need to find ways of assessing that and improving how we do things. And we're really interested in how we can improve our evidence base. And the way we think of it is the old idea is of evidence as a balance. So you're thinking whether or not someone is guilty, you have a balance of the weight of evidence by putting together the different bits of evidence and seeing whether or not that weight is sufficient to say that someone's guilty or someone's innocent. And we view it as a sort of a cube, and at the bottom is the information reliability. Is this a good bit of evidence? So is it a randomized controlled experiment, which could get a high score, or is it some anecdotal piece of information? Or if it's an observation, is there some photographs or video or eDNA or whatever? The source reliability, does this come from an independent source who's been shown to be reliable, or does it come from someone who has a clear agenda or shown to be inefficient? And then the relevance is, does this come from somewhere similar? Does it come from elsewhere in Australia, or does it come from Cambridge across the world, which would obviously be very different and much less relevant? So you put all those together and you have a cube depending on the weight of the evidence. And so let's then think about how we can interpret the reliability of different studies. And this is Alec Christie. And we brought together, I think, 44 huge, great studies with all of the people who produced those as co-authors that had done sort of before and after control intervention experiments in environmental fields. And we could then strip those down. And we could then imagine a set of experiments. So here we've got 3 fields, and we study them from 3 years beforehand, and then we do something, that's the tractor. And then we study those 3 fields for 3 years afterwards. And then, so this just illustrates the different designs. The first one is the after design, that blue box. Here we do something and then we see what the consequences are. So it's common to set up a marine protected area and see whether or not the fish population increase. That's an after design. Or you could do before and after, where you actually, that brown box, you study the populations beforehand, you do your action, and you study them afterwards. Or you could have controls. So in the middle, at the top, you do your experiment. At the bottom, you don't do anything. And so on the right-hand side, you have control versus impact. And then if you look at all 4 of those boxes, you have before and after control impact, which is your Backy design. And then you could randomize those. So if you do that, similarly, you have a randomized controlled experiment or a randomized Backy. These are the main different experimental designs, and they have different names, rather confusingly. Different people call these very different terms, but they're kind of the same idea. So then this says, how accurate are these different designs? This is a little bit confusing, but I'll walk you through this. So let's look at the right-hand column where it says plus or minus 50%. This is to say, how often is it that the result you get from the experiment is right to within 50%? And 50% isn't great, but let's say that's what we want. If you do an after experiment, those blue dots at the bottom, you get the right answer to within 15% on 16% of the occasions. So on 84% of the occasions, your result isn't accurate to within 50%. And if you do that a number of times, it doesn't really improve it, because that experimental design is so weak that doing lots of weak experiments doesn't really improve things much. If you do a controlled intervention, that's better. And if you do it before or after, that's also better. It's right to within 40%. If you do a randomized controlled trial, that's better. Or if you do a Backy design, that's better still. And in these better analyses, if you do more of them, if you replicate them, the accuracy goes up, because this is a good design, and you have more good designs, you get closer to the truth. So what this says is that the experimental design really matters. And what we do then is we then take the results from the plot, that square I showed you, of the weight of evidence, and you then can imagine taking a study and saying, I'm going to see how good that study is in terms of the relevance and the bias, which is difficult, and the quality. And we then plot these in what we call ziggurat plots. Ziggurats, I'm sure you know, are the Mesopotamian stepped buildings. And so on the x-axis is the score. So if it gets a 5 on each basis, it'll have a score of 125. And you then, so the right-hand column is 5 different studies, 2 which are pretty good, 1 which is not very good, and 2 which are really kind of quite lousy. And you put those together, and you can then visualize what the quality of the evidence is. And here's plotted, those on the right where it's very beneficial, those on the left are where it's weak. And this is an example. A funder asked us to look at their programs and assess the quality of the evidence for whether or not, if you give them flexible funding, do they invest in organizational development. We looked at the different studies and then saw how good the evidence was, whether or not they seemed to do that. And we also looked at some of the other literature, and this showed there was good evidence that that happened. So we see this as a way of putting together and showing a diversity of different studies. Then we have the evidence, we can pull the evidence together. We want some decision-making tools, and we're really interested in how you convert evidence into decisions. And we've got a whole range of different methods where we then embed the evidence. I'm just going to talk about one of those called the mind map. So in the center, we have snipe, a wading bird that we want to conserve in Britain. We have different snipes in Australia, also of interest. And for our snipe, the 4 issues, sort of if you surround them, they need food, they need safe nest sites, they need to avoid trampling, they need to avoid predation. So if you look at the food, we know that's important. So we've given it 3 pluses. There's evidence, there's good evidence that food's an important factor. So that's what the number of books shows, is the strength of the evidence. And then going on that, they require aquatic invertebrates. And one way of doing that is to create pools. They require soil invertebrates. They probe in the mud, in the soil. If you flood that, then that kills the invertebrates. But if it needs to be penetrable, so it's sufficiently soft, so you keep it damp, and you create rills, what are these shallow ditches that run through the grassland. So this is a way of expressing all of that evidence, all the ideas in a mind map, which I'm sure you're aware of, but this is an evidence-based mind map. And we've, in our book, Transforming Conservation, we've got evidence-based theories of change, evidence-based argument maps, evidence-based decision trees. So you can take evidence and insert it into decision-making tools. And we think that's an important way forward that just isn't done. And this is the book that describes how to do a lot of that. I just, as I was chatting to Bill beforehand, I'd like to just say a little bit about AI and how AI can improve the evidence base. And this is my super clever colleagues, Sadiq and Anil, who Sadiq Jaffa is a research fellow in the computing department, and Anil Madhavapeni is a professor of planetary computing, which is a very cool title in the computing department. And they're doing just mind-boggling work. So what we've done is we can start with some papers, and then we can use the existing language models to then cluster the literature. We can then take the conservation evidence databases and then train that to make a small language model to then cluster the papers that the language model has found. So we can then take the top 2.5 million paper abstracts, which meant negotiations with our publishers. We have journal subscriptions with them. we have a very impressive librarian who's been really fantastic in enabling us to get access to all of these papers. And we can then summarize those using a large language model. And then we retrieve there's 140 million papers we're aware of. We've got the 5 million that are most relevant. We've then retrieved the top 2.5 million, and we're then extracting the data from the PDFs, from graphs, and then using a language model to then work out where the evidence is within the paper. So this, I don't have the 3D version of this, I'm afraid, but this is the top 500,000 relevant research papers. And this is what I call the galaxy, the universe model. Each of these dots, each of these planets is research paper. So you can click on it and it'll tell you what that paper is. And those in green are the conservation evidence papers that test conservation actions. But then you can fly through those and you can look at one of those clusters in more detail, and it might be about transport, and then if you cluster going further, then it might be about roads, and then it might go clone further, and it might be about direct impacts of roads or fragmentation of roads, and so on. So it's clustered these papers in a way that makes sense, and that you can then analyze and see which papers are most likely to have tests of actions. And just so what then does it do? It then pulls out using vast numbers of parameters and finds papers that it seems to think is relevant to conservation evidence. So here's an example. There's a paper on hedgehogs, hedgehog removal on way to success. And we're asking it two questions. Firstly, does it seem to be suitable as a paper to include? And secondly, what classification would we give it? What synopsis would we put it in? And it's kind of interesting because this is a paper, it's largely about hedgehogs, but it is said, its category at the bottom is put in the category of birds, and it's identified this as a suitable paper. So both of which seem to be kind of quite clever. But if you see that little questioning face at the bottom, so the task we would have is we're given this, and we can then make the decision as to whether or not we think we should include it and whether or not the categorization is right. But we can get a second opinion. We can click that little questioning face at the bottom, and it then gives its justification for why it thinks this paper should be included. So it says, this study measures the effect of removing hedgehogs on way to nesting success in the Western Islands, Scotland. This experiment tests the conservation action, hedgehog removal, and its impact on wild taxa, making it clear it's an experimental test. It has clear implications for conservation evidence to include protect waders. It's clearly about conservation, therefore include category birds. So I just think it's amazingly clever. At scale, it's not only identified the relevant papers, but it provides its own justification as to why it should be included. And so if you disagree, it's like having a second opinion. You can then say whether or not this seems to be a good paper to include. So we're doing two things. We call that the evidence pipeline, the extraction of evidence. And we also want an evidence co-pilot where it takes the evidence and it uses the standard large language models like ChatGPT. So you can then ask it conservation questions, and it'll give you its assessment of the evidence and what that says. And we very much view this as a co-pilot. It doesn't tell you what to do. It's someone sitting next to you, giving a set of thoughts that you can then decide what to do. And also within this, we've also 3 weeks ago, we did a horizon scan with people sufficiently close to Cambridge that they came to see us, and then large numbers of people on the around the world identifying what the up and coming issues were in conservation, and also what many of the concerns were, in that AI has lots of problems, as I'm sure you're aware, and where you wanted to consider those as well. And just sort of some of the thoughts that, it can be hallucination, distribution data can be used by those wanting to exploit species. AI has serious changes for society that could have serious impacts for conservation. There's issues already with only some having access to the literature only being produced by a subset of groups. And that might be even more true with AI, so that only a small number of groups can really run these models and have influence as a result. AI computers use a lot of energy. The models, there's various studies showing how their biases built within identification models and models for selecting staff and all those sorts of things. There could be different knowledge systems, different ways of doing things that can be embedded in systems. There's a risk that AI can just generate fake material at scale. So how do we then realize what's fake and what isn't? How do we, and particularly if it generates lots of fake material and can do it in such a way to work out which are picked up by the search engines, it can then just create more and more of the material that's likely to be picked up by the search engines. So how are we going to see the real material against that fake material? And then obviously we see quite a lot of this already, that if there are people that want to do bad things to the world, that there's AI can provide new and different ways in which material can be interpreted because of manipulation. So there are challenges. Just a couple of other issues. Costs. We talk about the need to include costs, and Tom White has been analyzing this, and very rarely do people actually say what the costs are. But if they do say what the costs are, they just say, this is how much it cost us to do this action. And that actually tells us very little. What we want to know, I don't want to know how much it costs you to do the action. I want to know how much would it cost me. And for that, you need to know really what was the equipment that was needed, how much time did it take, what were the materials that are used. And if I know that, I can say, well, with the equipment I've got, and the rate at which I charge to my staff or volunteers or whatever it is, and the costs I have to pay for consumables, I can work out what the cost would be for me. And so we produced these structures for improving how we look at costs. And then just finally, we're really interested in embedding tests into practice. This to us is a major way forward, that there's a huge amount of monitoring and evaluation within projects, but we don't actually learn much from that monitoring and evaluation. For us, the way forward is to embed tests into practice. And for that, there's really, you do it on three conditions. You say, at the top left, what are the results that you actually want to know about? What do you care about? The top right, do you have the skills that are appropriate for carrying out a test? And then bottom, can you change the management plan to include an experiment? And people tend to say, oh, that's difficult. And the answer is, it's almost always is difficult. But if you say, for your organization, if I'm going to set up one test somewhere, where's the place that I could set up this test that would give me the results that I really want to know, that would be possible to do because there's skilled people there, and I could manage the tests, and I could manage in such a way so that I could do it. And it can be something simple. I've got an invasive plant. I'm going to treat 20 clumps this way, another 20 randomly selected clumps this way and look at their fate. But it could also be in different areas, sort of social action. So I'm looking at education parties, like we're chatting to Bill earlier about guerrillas. Supposing you had training programs for whether or not the people use masks or approach the guerrillas, you change those training programs, and then you have the guards saying how well the tourists behaved. That's a very simple thing for you to test. It's just thinking of those clever ways to test where it is possible to put it into practice. And we think this is really important way forward. And then, so for us, we think what needs to happen is we need to accept that there's serious problems. And increasingly, conservation organizations realize that there's serious problems. So we have our wildlife trusts, our major UK conservation organizations have declared what they call an evidence emergency. And that there are things that could be done. And that's largely a cultural shift. It's largely by saying, let's ensure when we're carrying out decisions, we reflect on the evidence before we make major decisions. And that if we're carrying out practice, let's try to embed tests into practice, perhaps a test a year. And these are 8 things that if you're a leader, you could just do today. You can say, well, from now on, if the job adverts for decision making, you're going to specify the need for evidence-based practice. I'm going to put someone responsible for strategy of evidence use. I'm going to think about how we can provide training on evidence use. I'm going to state that if there are plans, then it has to explain how the evidence was incorporated. If I contract reports, I'm going to require a statement on evidence use. That routinely in the organization, from the top down, does your manager routinely ask about the underlying evidence is one of the questions that's going to be asked. If there's funding, ensure that there's applications reflect on the underlying evidence. And make sure that someone's responsible for setting up an experiment, say once a year. And the world is moving. So we ran a workshop, the details are online, and 9 different organizations over the last month have decided to become much more evidence-based, including major organizations. US Fish and Wildlife Service have decided to be much more evidence-based as a result. Traffic International have decided to be embed tests into practice. So there's a real change, I think, happening. So what are the ways forward? We need to accept there's a problem. So some conservation acts, large-scale conservation projects are not delivering. Guidance is often old. Agri-environment schemes can be wasteful. Protected areas can be ineffective unless properly managed. Consultants frequently rely on out-of-date and unsatisfying information. Processes used in decision-making often poor. So the challenge, I think, will be when people start questioning things, when auditors start questioning government spending, when funders realize that a lot of their funding is ineffective, when businesses are wary of investing in actions shown to be ineffective, when there's the evidence crisis is realized, when high-level governments expect evidence to be used, when the authority of planning decisions is questioned because of the lack of evidence. So what we need is the evidence to be reasonably complete. These are the enablers, tools available, processes to encourage evidence use by the community, processes to ease the embedding of tests. And if we have that, the changes we can hope is that practitioners will routinely reflect on evidence. Government agencies will demand evidence use. There'll be routine testing of actions. Funders will ask applicants why they expect their proposals to work. There's 18 funders that now do that already. As part of their process, they ask why they think the action will work. Businesses will want to know about the evidence and demanding risks. Consultants will have to be evidence-based. And the consequences of this is it become unthinkable not to reflect on the evidence before making decisions. Evidence will be embedded into policy and practice. conservation becomes more attractive to fund as it's shown to be better. So there's going to be more and greater effective conservation. So there'll be a markedly improved environment with better funded and more effective practice. So that's the vision. And just to say briefly, alongside that, there's an understanding of knowledge. And I've just been creating this YouTube video. If you're feeling bored, it's a great way of going to sleep at night. Have a look at that. So I've been slightly pessimistic. I'd like to talk on high point. There is, I think, a change taking place. So here's a demonstration taking place and someone saying, what do we want? Evidence-based change. When do we want it? After peer review. Or here's me with my daughters. This is an old photo you can probably recognize from the change in me, and my kids are both finished university now. But Anna Sutherland, age 10, school report. Anna's progressing well, but must take a more evidence-based approach. So it's kind of a bit damning for me as a father. But what this shows is that right at the beginning of school, people are taking evidence very seriously. And for me, that's an exciting way forward. And then this is the QR code. If you want to look up, the book is open access, so you can have a look at it for free. Thanks very much, and nice to talk to you.
Thank you, Bill. Do we have any questions? Maybe I'll start with one.
Go ahead, sir.
Oh, well, we'll do online second, Bill, because I have the microphone.
Power.
So I was just thinking about machine language models. Obviously, there's going to be some writers who are more compelling and perhaps overstate the importance of their research. That will influence what the AI believes to be true, won't it?
Well, what our AI does is it extracts the evidence. So this is what we call the evidence pipeline. So it finds the studies, and where we've got to so far is it takes the studies, it says this seems to be a test of an action. This is a test of action, say, about birds. And then the next stage in the pipeline it will say, this is the experimental design, this is where it was, this is the action that was carried out, this was the results. So it'll just be pulling out the results. So you might say, this is very, very powerful result, but we will actually look at what the result is itself. It is, as you say, it's a common problem we have, that papers will often say in the summary, all these stuff and, all these important, exciting messages. And when you look at the results, they're not there. There's often a mismatch between the results and the summary.
That's how we get it published.
Sorry?
That's how we get it published in the first place.
Yeah, it is remarkable.
Okay, and my second, I guess it's more an observation. So in my 30-year career, I have done Backy-style experiments, and I've done a lot of after environmental problem research. And I would say that for someone particularly interested in landscape scale problems like myself, the Backy design is a much smaller, it's much more expensive, and it's a much smaller sample size. So, for example, in my PhD, I captured 4,000 birds across, looking at the impacts of roads. And I radio tracked maybe 30 birds where I dispersed, and on one hand, I had 3 species which I radio tracked and knew with evidence what would happen if I moved them across clearings. But I had 4,000 bird captures of over 125 different bird species. So one's purely an after study and one's a manipulative study. And, and both of them required obviously lots of field time. But I guess my point being, those manipulative studies are much, much smaller. Like it's an order of magnitude, the difference in terms of time and money and data that you can get.
And yeah, indeed. And so I think the skill, and I think this is the real challenge, and where our plan is to set up a testing unit to provide this sort of guidance. What's the best balance for that sort of problem? What's the balance between the rigor you can get for doing something that's well designed, and the work shows that that rigor really is important, and the practicalities of different designs? And I think our economic colleagues are very good at this. Our economic colleagues are very good at saying, here's a policy that's going to be rolled out. Let's have it so that it's done at different states at different times. Let's look across the border where it's done in this state, but not this, and then compare a set of sites that run across that. They do those sorts of neat experiments. And that is really what I think we need to do, rather than just saying, here's a project that's taking place, how do I monitor it? Because often that is very difficult to do.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'll go ahead and ask a question, Bill, if that's all right. Bill, they say that if you're confronted with a situation that's very urgent, or you have to make a really fast decision, they say don't try to. A common response is don't try to think about it. Use your intuition, your gut, because that's actually a better computer. The gut compared to the conscious thinking can process things at something like 1,000 times faster. And it also can integrate much wider range of information. So if a tiger's coming at you, or, whatever, a big truck, you don't have time to sit down and think about it. Your body's, you're going to have a lot of instincts that are going to tell you what to do and give you some guidance here. I'm wondering how you think about that kind of notion. And I guess I've tended to maybe think that, intuitive, there's so much, as you would well know, there's so much of the resource management and other things that are happening, conservation management, that is based, I think, as some of your examples show, substantially on intuition. But there are some people out there, if you talk to park managers in Australia, most of what they do is not based on science. It's based on basically their intuition, their kind of common knowledge, information they get from colleagues, maybe what the boss said. You know what I'm talking about. And I know you've kind of got this campaign to change this. And but I'm just wondering also, do you think this is a Quixotean, venture to try to change this culture, or do you see any advantages of this notion of sort of using your intuition in some circumstances, maybe when information is very limited?
So, I agree. So Kahneman wrote about type 1 and type 2 thinking, which is what you're talking about. So type 1 thinking is, there's a tiger in the room, someone, the fire alarm goes off, someone says, I say to you, Bill, do you want a beer now? You will give an immediate response based on, you'll kind of know how to respond to that. They're type 1 problems, and type 2 problems are complicated problems. And both of them make sense. And, you don't want type 2 thinking about, I know people like this, do you want a beer? And they spend half an hour thinking about it. That's kind of mad. Or there's a tiger released. You just act. But the more serious problem is where you have type 2 problems and type 1 thinking. And I'm sure we can think of political leaders around the world that are kind of that sort, that don't have that depth of thinking. And, so looking at conservation evidence as a source of information, I'm not saying as by any means the only source of information, takes minutes to look things up. To actually say, here's a problem, I'm a reserve manager, can I really not spend an hour searching through the literature and seeing what other people say and have done and learn from that? And then taking that body of knowledge, and we very much talk about reflecting on evidence. We don't talk about following it. It's reflecting on it. Here's a body of knowledge. Let's combine that with our experience and the local knowledge in that area, perhaps including indigenous knowledge, and let's include our values and put all three of those together to decide what to do. But it's really all three of those. And my concern is that the looking at the evidence and not reflecting on the evidence is remarkably common, as you're suggesting. And it's mad. If you're deciding how to manage a site, why not find out what other people have done managing similar sites and learn from them.
Good point.
Do I?
Can I ask a question?
Noel, shut up. Bob Wasson. Bill, thank you. I'm with you in your intent. But having...
I knew I was going to start something with that. Okay, yes.
Yeah.
No,
I
was happy with the beginning of this.
Yes. No, I truly am. But it seemed, having spent a fair amount of time reading the political science literature on these sorts of issues, and there's an Englishman by the name of Kearney who's written particularly well on this subject. It's pretty clear that I mean, Kearney's very tough on scientists. He basically
is this Mike Kenny?
Yeah. He basically says, you guys have got it wrong. This is not how decisions are made. Science is a small part of any decision making made in a political environment. Now, there's a degree of self-interest in that statement. He's a political scientist. But that said, he's probably correct. That people, politicians, senior bureaucrats making decisions in government agencies have to take account of a multitude of stakeholders, not just the scientific concerns. And that could be local communities' interests and concerns. It could be industry. It could be any manner of things. So, by the way, I'd be a little bit cautious about using economists only. They have a very myopic view of the world, like engineers, but that's another matter. So it seems to me that can I propose to you that you instill a test in your own work, this workshop that you mentioned. It would be really useful to follow up on what actually happened. These organizations say they want to use evidence. What has happened 5 years later?
Yeah, indeed, and we're really interested in. Would really love to think of how we could do a test of the effectiveness of conservation, and effectiveness of evidence-based conservation, and we've discussed that in various ways, and kind of rather like the medical example where they had a wing of a hospital that the other wings, did good practice. They had well-trained people who were using their experience and their knowledge and the bits of literature they came across, and then they had another wing that was doing that, but also looking at the evidence when they're doing things. And as I said, 19% fewer people died. We really want to see if we can do something equivalent to that. But I agree. I agree about what you're saying about Mike Kenny's work and his book showing that this is how decisions are made. But to me, if you don't reflect on the evidence, and my experience is you talk to almost anyone in any field, they're talking, or many fields, and you ask why they're making the decisions they do, and they're not really using the evidence widely and really thinking about it. And when they do that, I think that's inappropriate. If they're taking the evidence and then deciding for political reasons or other reasons we're not going to do it, that to me is fine. I don't believe that you have to just do what the evidence says. You take the evidence and what we say, you reflect on the evidence. You think, is it relevant, and how do you balance it with these other factors? And our concern, and you see this in the conservation organizations, you ask as Bill's example, you say to land managers, why are you doing this? What I want the land managers to say, well, the science shows this. And by the way, I've decided not to do this because I think here these factors are more important. That's fine. But to not know what the science says, to me, is terrible. It's criminal.
Sorry, I just wanted to make one quick comment and ask Bill. Sorry, Sue, very brief. Bill, is your experience, my sense is that not all research organizations or NGOs are even would necessarily want to have their research and findings scrutinized. Do you see any sense of that at all? Or I helped a European organization try to set up a sort of an evidence-based evaluation. And one of the things that became clear is there were certain programs that they had that they were proud of, and they were very happy to see those featured and scrutinized, but others, they really didn't want to go there. And I think they just thought that would be counterproductive. So it's just.
And I think you're right. And that has been a problem in other fields too. And for us, one of the solutions is you don't say, is my program a success? Because your program is obviously a success, we're not going to question that. But my program consists of these different actions. Let's test those different actions. And if you do that, you can say, well, overall, of course, my program was a fantastic success, but I tested, and particularly I compared these different means of getting tourists to wear masks when they're visiting the gorillas, different means of encouraging the creation of new tree planting, whatever it is. And this turns out to be more effective than that. And I think that doesn't threaten the organization, but means that we learn. Noel's had his hand up for a long time. I don't know if you noticed that.
Sorry.
I've gone to sleep. No, it's been really interesting. Thanks, Bill. I'm Noel Priest. I'm doing some research with a number of people on restoration practices. And one of the problems I think we face, and this relates to the title of your talk, is the change in culture. And one of the fundamental problems is scientific literacy. And when I say I want to see the evidence, it's very easy to present evidence that's perceived by non-scientists to be really valuable. So I can, plant a reforest a patch of ground, and it can look really, really great. And community groups do that all the time. But they don't tell you that, half of them might have died initially, and they had to replace them, and then another third died, that sort of thing. And then they have a look at the replicated experiments, and there's 90 plots on a place that we've been doing a large-scale experiment, and they see all these gaps and patches and so on, and they say, well, that's evidence that what Noel didn't work. So somehow we have to change the narrative about what is actual evidence and what is the scientific literature showing. So I think we need to be really careful about that, because otherwise we're going to keep losing because politicians and government decision makers often don't have that scientific literacy. They're often bureaucrats, or they work outside this sort of field. Can you comment on that, please?
No, I think that's really important. So we wrote a paper in Nature, including with David Spiegelhalter, you might have heard of, and Mark Bergman, who I suspect you probably all know well. And that came about because I went to the Institute for Government, and the Institute for Government does training for governments. And we were talking about how to embed science. And they were sort of talking about improving scientific literacy. And I thought that is a waste of time. Supposing you won't get 3 days of someone's time, but supposing you did get 3 days, you'd have an hour on evolution and half an hour on ecology or something like that. It just doesn't work. You cannot teach science to people in a day or two. But what I think you can teach is understanding of how to interpret evidence. You can understand controls, regression to the mean, cherry picking, all of these sorts of things. Correlation is not causation. And to me, the suggestion we made was we gave 10 or 20 ideas that any decision maker should understand. And my suggestion was that, one of the questions that they ask MPs is, what's the cost of a pint of milk, half a litre of milk? The idea is to say, do you understand the real world? And I think there should be standard tests about, do you understand the basics of interpreting information? And that you could do that training in a day. These are the basic bits of information you should understand. And I see it in reading the newspapers. In reading the newspapers, you just come across continual errors of misunderstanding through those basic ideas, and you hear it amongst politicians all the time. And that, to me, is a winnable thing to do. we didn't win on that yet, but I think you know. So our solution was that for prospective members of Parliament, they say we're going to ask you a question about interpretation of evidence, interpretation of science, and here's the guide. You know, and okay, there's our paper, but it could be some other guide. Here's the guide to tell you how to do that. So you just make sure you understand these facts because we're going to quiz you on.
Thanks, Bill.
Any more questions online or here? No? Well, thank you very much, Bill, for your time today and for a really interesting lecture. We really appreciate it and hope to see you again soon sometime.
Yeah, good. Yeah, no, it'd be lovely to come visit you at James Cook sometime. Sometime we'll see. And hope to see some of you in Cambridge sometime. Good to see you all.
Invitation, Bill. Thanks very much. Okay.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for the interesting questions.
Thank you. Okay.